Hello, everyone, and welcome to Politics and Prose Live. Before we start, I just have some quick housekeeping notes for you. I just want to point your attention to the green button at the bottom of the screen. You can click that button at any time tonight and purchase tonight's book on Politics and Prose's website. Our physical stores are closed right now, and we need everyone's help to keep bringing you programming like this. Also tonight, you can ask the author a question, which we highly encourage. If you click on the Ask a Question feature, which is also below, you can also read other people's questions and even vote on the ones you'd like to hear answered the most. And also a reminder that the author, the host, or other audience members can't see you through the screen, so feel free to get comfy. And finally, we want to thank you tonight for being with us and helping to keep us afloat. So tonight, I am honored to welcome David Rohde to Politics and Prose Live to discuss his book, In Deep, The FBI, the CIA, and the Truth About America's Deep State. David Rohde is a two-time Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and currently an executive editor of the New Yorker website and a CNN global affairs analyst. In Deep investigates the notion of a deep state, something that 3/4 of Americans believe in and is distrusted by both the left and the right. David draws upon extensive interviews with the CIA and FBI officials to determine whether these government agencies are protecting or undermining the country. So without any further ado, please help me welcome David Rohde.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So I'm just going to speak for about 25 or 30 minutes here about the book and why I wrote it, but I'm most eager to take questions from all of you. So here goes, and thank you again for coming, and I'm just thrilled that you folks are interested in the book, and I hope I answer all your questions effectively and make sense here. I want to first explain, why I wrote the book. There was a mention of a poll that found that, more than 70% of Americans felt that there was a group of government officials and military officials who secretly manipulate national policy in Washington. This was a 2018 poll, came out earlier in the year. And what was interesting as I explored the book was that there's both fears on the left and the right of some kind of deep state. Liberals tend to refer to it as the military-industrial complex, a cabal of generals and defense contractors that push the country into endless wars. Conservatives fear more, the term they use is the administrative state. That would be an ever-growing government, a federal government that they feel is constantly encroaching on the individual rights and lives of Americans and taking away, their liberties. And one of the striking things about the poll was that the groups that had the highest, fear of this deep state were on the one side of the political spectrum, NRA members who, felt or feared that the government would take away their arms, and then the other side were minorities. And it would make sense that many African Americans, given the long history of discrimination and the many issues faced in the criminal justice system, why they would not trust the government. Fully 8 in 10 Americans in this survey felt they were being improperly surveilled by the U.S. government. And then to bring it up to the current day, right now, in the middle of the pandemic, the coronavirus that has us all in our homes, is again this big question. Can we trust our government officials? Anthony Fauci, the country's top infectious disease expert, has, gotten a lot of praise, but also been criticized. There are supporters of President Trump who think Fauci's exaggerated the danger posed by coronavirus. The protests that went on saying that the stay-at-home orders were excessive and included chants of fire Fauci. So now Fauci has joined the long list of career government officials who are sort of accused of being a deep state and undermining Trump. The president has retweeted some tweets that have said that, but the president has also gone out of his way to praise Fauci in press conferences and support him and praise his work. And a central question, and you can ask me about this in the Q&A, did a skepticism of government experts in the White House or from the president himself slow the response to the coronavirus? There's been reporting by other news outlets about that, but I'd be happy to take questions on that later. The book starts historically, and it actually starts in the 1970s. And again, it's trying to address, really two broad questions. One is, how do you prevent the CIA and the FBI, these two incredibly powerful agencies, from committing abuses and also how do you, prevent a president from using them to commit abuses. And this all comes to a head in the 70s because of a big investigation. Some of you may have heard it. Many people in Washington may remember it, called the Church Committee. And this was a Senate investigation into the CIA and the FBI that was chaired by Senator Frank Church of Idaho in 1976 and 1977. And the Church report, as it was known, uncovered decades of abuses by the FBI and the CIA. The CIA was surveilling Americans inside this country. They surveilled John Lennon when he protested the Vietnam War. The FBI was harassing Martin Luther King, bugging his phones without any warrants and trying to smear him. And also the FBI was harassing members of the John Birch Society on the right. J. Edgar Hoover had a list of 18,000 Americans to be rounded up that were considered subversives. This would be in the case of an emergency. People on that list included Norman Mailer. There was public outrage after this. There was also, after Watergate, a sense that the presidency was out of control. So the book talks about a series of reforms that were put in place by President Ford and then President Carter to try to stop abuses by the FBI and the CIA. A big change in the CIA was that in the past, when the CIA carried out a covert action in a foreign country, it was an informal verbal conversation between the director of the CIA and the president. A new requirement that came out in the late 70s was that there be a written finding signed by the president that authorized a covert action program overseas. Those written findings were distributed to senior leaders in Congress of both parties, so both parties knew what was happening. Ford issued and Carter strengthened a ban on assassinations. The CIA was also banned from operating in the United States. In terms of the FBI, there was a 10-year term set up for FBI directors to avoid situations like J. Edgar Hoover's multi-decade tenure, and reports that Hoover had corrected dirt on politicians and then used them as blackmail. The FBI was also found to have spied on the Supreme Court. And there was a new attorney general. His name was Edward Levy, who was put in by President Ford, and he tried to make the attorney general position an apolitical position. Levy really created the model of the modern attorney general, and this would be that a president can tell an attorney general, this is my law enforcement priority. I want you to go investigate pharmaceutical companies for price gouging. That's fine. That's a president's right, a democratically elected president. That's a mandate he has from voters, and the attorney general can go carry out that broad campaign. But the precedent Levy set was that it would be improper for the president to say, I want the attorney general and the Justice Department to go investigate that CEO because that CEO didn't give me, the kind of campaign contribution I wanted. Lastly, to prevent some of the black bag jobs, as the FBI called them, where they would go and tap Americans' phones without any court orders, a new court was created. This is now you've got the legislative branch has new intelligence committees to oversee intelligence. There's a judiciary committee already overseeing the FBI. And now there would be a court that would oversee FBI applications to surveil Americans for national security reasons. This is now, many of you maybe know it, the Fisa court, it's based on the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. And that was to force the FBI to present evidence to a federal judge in a secret proceeding that would justify the wiretapping of an American who was thought to be possibly working with agents of a foreign country, and later on after 9/11, extremists. One of the central characters of the book in the beginning is a member of the Church Committee. His name is Fritz Schwartz. Fritz Schwartz's middle initials are A.O., so his name was F.A.O. Schwartz. He grew up in Manhattan. He was a member of the famous family that owned the famous toy store. And Schwartz was, really a member of the country's elite. He went to Harvard and, was a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. And it was interesting when I asked him about what went wrong and why had things gotten so out of control during the Cold War. He said that one of the strangest parts of his job as a staffer and a lead investigator was interviewing CIA officials and FBI officials. Schwartz thought he would get along better and kind of identify more with CIA officials who tended to be then overwhelmingly WASPs who went to Ivy League schools. But instead, he found interviewing these CIA officials he said, blood chilling, because they were so incredibly good at lying. He could barely catch them in lies. They were so convincing, and they seemed to lie so easily and without any real sense of remorse. And he actually identified more with some of the FBI agents. He was more alarmed by what the FBI did, in that they were investigating and undermining constitutionally protected political activities. And what struck him was the rationale that emerged among FBI agents, that they had to take these actions, they had to break into these houses and protect the country from the spread of communism, the growth of Vietnam War protests that they feared was funded by foreign governments, and that the rationale was that they had to take these steps to sort of, protect the country. And it's a theme here about, a problem I think we have today, where there's such distrust and division in our country that each side is kind of rationalizing the actions they have to take to stop the other side. And the sort of depth of our discord and division and belief in conspiracy theories is growing more and more intense. And that's, again, something we can talk about later on. The book sort of moves through the next several presidencies in terms of, does this new oversight system work? It talks about the Iran-Contra affair, which was where the White House aides went on and carried out a covert action plan without informing oversight committees in Congress. It was a large scandal. The system essentially held. But there was a group of conservatives. One of them is now the Attorney General of the country, Bill Barr. He's a young Republican at that point, and he is sort of following the lead in the 80s of Antonin Scalia, the conservative scholar and later Supreme Court Justice, Dick Cheney, who's an official in the Ford administration, and Donald Rumsfeld. And there's a real belief put out by Scalia that the Watergate reforms, all these reforms that gave greater power to Congress, one other institution that was created are inspectors general, independent inspectors general appointed by Congress largely, and to oversee the executive branch. And the feeling of Barr and members of this movement, Ed Meese, Reagan's attorney general, felt the same way, was that Congress's ability, or the abilities to have these oversight committees, inspectors general, also special prosecutors, was seen as an overreach, in the sense that the American presidency had been weakened too much. Bill Barr, from that period, he goes on to serve as attorney general under George H.W. Bush, has consistently fought to restore the presidential power that he felt was lost during Watergate. In a recent speech last fall to the Federalist Society, Barr talked about how he felt that the executive branch was the most important branch in the federal government, that it did the most to save the country from crisis. For moments like this, when we're facing a pandemic or a war, he felt if you looked at American history, it was the executive branch that proved the most decisive and most effective and acted the fastest in moments that sort of threatened the country. He argued that the legislative branch was inherently slower to react, and the judicial branch also couldn't, execute policy. In the speech he gave last fall, he said that he still feels there's too much power vested in the other branches of Congress. He feels that Congress's oversight efforts by Democrats are simply efforts to sort of lay siege to the Trump administration. And he criticized judges, how he asked in this speech, how can a federal judge in California or Oregon block one of President Trump's executive orders on immigration? The book continues through sort of 9/11. The big crisis there is warrantless eavesdropping by President George H.W. Bush. Again, part of the new system is that this FISA court is supposed to approve any eavesdropping that goes on of Americans. And after 9/11, Dick Cheney, then vice president, and George W. Bush carry out, a massive eavesdropping program without going to the court. They just simply, interpret that the court needs to, it doesn't have the prerogative. And if the president feels the country's in imminent danger, the president can carry out surveillance programs as the president sees fit. Another kind of character in the book appears at this point. His name is Jim Baker. At that point, he's a Justice Department official whose job is to present these applications for surveillance. And he told me a story about just after 9/11, he was just outside of the Justice Department, and a colleague of his that he'd worked with before at the FBI came up to him. And at this point, he had no idea there was any extra surveillance happening. And this FBI official came up to Baker and said, there's something spooky going on, but wouldn't go into details. And essentially, Baker gets enough information to realize that there is this new program, Stellar Wind, being carried out. He finds out that the FISA court, the federal judges, are not being told about this new program, and he essentially decides that he's not going to present any more applications for surveillance to the FISA court judges until the rest of the administration agrees that the judges should hear about the program. There's other people who join in this protest. Eventually, the FISA court judges are told about this after 9/11. None of this is public yet. The story hasn't been broken. It would be by the New York Times. And the judges are told, and they don't object to the wireless wiretapping, the chief FISA court judge at that point. I'll come back to this. I think the FISA court is sort of the biggest failure of the various mechanisms that were set up to limit CIA and FBI abuses. There's tremendous controversy about FISA court warrants that were issued to surveil Carter Page, one of President Trump's former campaign advisors, and we can talk about that more in the Q&A. But there's been a failure over and over by the FISA court to not question these applications that they're getting. I think the FISA court system is too secretive and not adversarial enough. I'll jump to 2016 on that note in terms of Trump and Russia and that investigation. I sort of have followed closely the Inspector General's investigation or all the debates about the Trump-Russia investigation. I'll tell one simple anecdote to keep this moving along about my own experience in the summer of 2016. I had the dossier. I think every major news organization had it. I worked at Reuters at that point, and a colleague of mine got a copy of it from Glenn Simpson of GPS Fusion. We worked all summer to try to confirm the details in the dossier. I went to a senior Justice Department official. I had seen the reports in the dossier that said that Carter Page had been meeting with Russian officials, and I asked this official, can you confirm that Carter Page, a Trump campaign advisor, this was, I think, in late July, has been meeting with Russian officials in Moscow that are close to Vladimir Putin. At this point, the hacking of emails was already occurring, and Russia was suspected of doing it. And the Justice Department official refused to comment, wouldn't say anything either way. September, about mid-September, 6 weeks before the election, I was doing a big story for Reuters about John Brennan's reforms to the CIA. He's still director at that point. The 2016 election hasn't happened. I meet with Brennan. I'm sitting in the director's office of CIA headquarters. It's this sort of beautiful afternoon. You look out the window and you can see this amazing canopy of trees outside the windows of the director's office in Langley. And I asked Brennan, is it true, Director Brennan, that the Russian government has compromising videotapes, which, according to the dossier, of the Republican nominee at that point, Donald Trump. And, Brennan was very quiet. He didn't really say anything. And then he said, look, I'm not going to engage on this at all. I'm not confirming what you're hearing. I'm not denying what you're hearing. I'm not engaging at all. And then he said to me, look, you're going to hear a lot of crazy things in the final 6 weeks of this campaign. You're going to hear a lot of crazy things about Donald Trump. You're going to hear a lot of crazy allegations about Hillary Clinton. And Brennan actually urged me to not write anything that I couldn't confirm very, very thoroughly. He sort of urged me to be very cautious in the last 6 weeks of the election and to make sure what I reported was accurate. And I mentioned that anecdote because, there's an allegation that Brennan was out distributing the dossier. That was not my experience. And the one thing I'll say in defense of the press and in defense of Reuters, where I worked at that point, was that nearly every major news outlet never reported any detail of the dossier over the course of the 2016 campaign. If the press wanted to sabotage Trump, they would have done that. And more importantly, if the FBI and CIA wanted to sabotage Trump's campaign, the easiest way they could have done that would be to leak the fact that they had the Trump-Russia investigation, that it had been opened in late July. They did not.
Looks like we lost David for a sec. David, if you can hear me, if you could just refresh your browser. Hopefully we can get this back going as soon as possible. Oh, hey, welcome back. Sorry about that.
I'm almost done, if
okay.
Folks are still out there. So, 2016 election. We'll talk about that more later. Part of the book, too, is I kind of look into how the term deep state is sort of first applied to the United States. It actually, was first applied in a really wide way after the 2017 election. There is a article in Breitbart by an anonymous writer who uses the pen name Virgil. This occurs in November. At this point, Trump is, has won the election, is naming the members of his cabinet. There are lots of stories being leaked at this point about contacts between the Trump campaign and Russia. And this is written about in Breitbart, and it's a warning in this story that this sort of epic struggle in this Breitbart piece, it warns that an epic struggle between the deep state and Donald Trump was about to begin. But prior to that, story, the deep state was primarily used to talk about the government of to talk about Turkey and how Turkey's military had limited the spread of democracy there. There was some references to it in terms of Egypt as well, the Egyptian military limiting the spread of democracy there. And then there was one book that prior to 2016 mentioned the deep state in detail. That was a 2007 book written by a University of California at Berkeley professor named Peter Dale Scott. He mentions the deep state in his book, and I tracked down Professor Scott and interviewed him. And his interpretation of the deep state was kind of a combination of the liberal and conservative views, but he questioned 9/11. He worried that the kind of military-industrial complex of the intelligence agencies had staged 9/11 or somehow led us into the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. But Peter Dale Scott was also worried about Wall Street and the financial industry and what kind of influence they had. He feels today that the term deep state has been used in so many different ways. He said it's been vulgarized. And I do feel it's as a term, it's become sort of a political weapon that's thrown around, and sometimes the president himself says it, sometimes his supporters. But that if there's someone who is undermining President Trump, they're called a member of the deep state. I spent about 18 months on this book. I spoke to current and former Trump administration officials. I spoke to former members of the Bush and Obama administrations and some Clinton officials. The most extreme claim the president has made, that there is a deep state that's carrying out a coup against him. Every official I spoke to said they had never seen evidence of government officials, career government officials, plotting, secretly and actively a coup to undermine a democratically elected president. Every president has been frustrated with government bureaucrats, which is a negative way to describe them. Again, it's a question of language. If you like government, you will say they are public servants. If you don't like government, they're pencil pushers. And so I think the use of these terms is very important. In the book, I talk about the permanent government or the institutional government, the roughly 3 million people who work in the federal government. This is excluding the military, civilians, for years and years, and who are supposed to be apolitical. But look, anyway, presidents get frustrated with the federal agencies. Ronald Reagan, when he came into office, he felt that the State Department was too soft on communism and not carrying out his agenda. When Barack Obama came into office, he feared the Pentagon. He felt that generals were leaking numbers for how many troops we might need in Afghanistan, and that was boxing him into a larger troop surge than he wanted to do. But no president has accused civil servants of carrying out a coup. And so I found that there is no deep state in the conspiratorial way that Donald Trump refers to it. no evidence that I can find. And I even had people in the president's own administration agree that they felt the talk of a coup was an exaggeration. At the same time, the FBI and the CIA are very powerful agencies. I think there needs to be sweeping oversight of them. But that is my sense that the president is exaggerating, which he does sometimes. But in terms of this allegation, no evidence of a coup. I talked to one aide of President Trump, though, and he said that the sense of kind of siege and frustration that the president feels is real. And the president would want to, do a certain policy, let's say pull U.S. troops out of Syria, and he would talk to his advisors about it. And to be fair to the president and all elected officials, in our democracy, the elected leaders should have the power. Every 2 or 4 or 6 years, elections are held, and each of these politicians gets a mandate to carry out the policies they promised the voters. When they arrive in Washington, civil servants, should carry out those policies. They claim that they do. I talked to many civil servants. One was Joan Dempsey. She was a career intelligence officer, served in the Navy first, and then in the Defense Intelligence Agency, and then became the number 3 official at the CIA. She said, look, there's bad apples. There's people that are, lots of hot air, people who don't work as hard as others. But she said most people abide by the many rules that exist, such as the Hatch Act, which bars federal civil servants from engaging in political activities. And she basically referred to most career civil servants in the federal government as competent do-gooders. And there was a sense of resentment among many of the career officials I spoke to, that they felt like that, generally speaking, the FBI and the CIA, and there's clearly exceptions, there's bad eggs, there's been scandals and things that have happened, but that generally they have accepted these rules of the road that were introduced way back in the 70s, that they go and testify before congressional committees. Maybe they don't reveal everything, but they reveal most things, such as covert action programs, probably to cover themselves, because these rules of the road gave a way for undercover CIA operatives or FBI agents to operate in the field and feel like they wouldn't be punished if a new president was elected for what they had done in the field, and suddenly, the country's beliefs and what was proper and wasn't proper would change. And they argue that the political class is sort of out of control, and in a way using them politically to gain support. I'll close on one of the last main characters in the book. His name is Tom O'Connor. He's a career FBI agent. He was a police officer in Western Massachusetts. O'Connor, he had this sort of amazing career. He was assigned to go investigate the bombing of the USS Cole and recovered those sailors' bodies there. 9/11 happens, and he goes to the Pentagon. He and other FBI agents collect over 2,000 bags of human remains at the Pentagon. He goes to Iraq, and he investigates the shooting of Iraqi civilians by Blackwater security guards there. He comes back and investigates white supremacists in the U.S. Recently, he was one of the people that was in Congress when Jon Stewart testified very emotionally, along with a 9/11 first responder who was dying of cancer, castigating Congress for not providing more funds for first responders to 9/11. Tom O'Connor was right there, just a couple rows back. Tom retired on 9/11 this year, ending his career. And in talking to him and other members of the FBI and some intelligence officials, the organizations are divided like the rest of American society. There's chunks of people in the FBI and the CIA who really love President Trump, and there's others who don't. But there's a general kind of frustration with our politicians and our political system. There's a frustration with the media. Please ask me about that. And so I asked O'Connor, would you ever consider, trying to clean up this mess? Would you ever, run for office? And O'Connor said, no way. I want to do something that has meaning. And, I think it's a statement and a sort of alarming thing with our politics, with our media, our press coverage, that the public, that you would have someone like Tom O'Connor. Do we have people in the government who are increasingly alienated and just sort of want to get out? I'm told that the recruiting numbers at the FBI are fine and the CIA as well. But there is this sense of how toxic our politics are becoming, that people don't want to go into government service. They feel they just are sort of tired of the back and forth. The shutdown really took a toll on the FBI. O'Connor was the head of the Agents Association, and they weren't paid for weeks and weeks and weeks. And so that cynicism, that frustration, that lack of belief, bluntly, in our democracy and our democratic system, is a real warning sign for us as we go into the 2020 election. That, I fear that we're sort of trapped in a cycle of distrust and disdain and conspiracy theories. And if this continues, it's going to be harder for us. And just ending on the coronavirus again, if we can't agree on basic facts, if we just think the worst of each other, don't trust claims by the other side, don't trust any reports by any of the news media, we're not going to be able to help each other. We're not going to be able to agree on how to respond to the coronavirus. And we're not going to be able to, I think, be a healthy society and democracy and help save each other's lives. That's about 30 minutes. I'd be delighted to take questions from anyone who's out there. And again, thank you so much for listening to me.
Thank you so much, David. That was really, really fascinating. And everyone, just want to remind you that you can purchase David's book, In Deep, at any time by clicking on the green button below the screen. We have a lot of great questions here. And the first one is, to what degree is Russia and Putin responsible for the state of our polarized politics today?
I think the Russians took advantage of pre-existing divisions in our country. I don't think it's great what the Russian interference in the 2016 election. I applaud the Senate Intelligence Committee, which is run by Republicans. Affirmed again the basic finding after the 2016 election that Russia did intervene to help Trump in the election. There is no judgment on whether it made a difference or not. But I would say that that's an example of bipartisanship. That's an example of the Republicans, pushing back on a major talking point of their president, and putting sort of facts above party. So same answer, though. I think that they are taking it. We need to face our own divisions and the kind of, the weakness of some of our institutions and the problems I talked about in terms of our democracy, that's the primary problem that they're taking advantage of. But it starts with us, Russia.
So this is a related question. What are you watching for / worried about, excuse me, for the upcoming election? Russian interference, Chinese, other countries? Are there media outlets you consider more reliable or more suspect or manipulated?
So I'm a mainstream journalist. I have a bias. Most journalists I know try to get the facts out. There's a lot of commentators and there's plenty of that on both sides. And my kind of simple thing on where information, and what I worry about is all the disinformation and misinformation that's out there. The internet is a great thing, but it's also, you can find the conspiracy theory of your choice with, 5 or 10 keystrokes. So in terms of sources, if somebody, leans right, if you tend to be more conservative, I would urge you, if you're seeing kind of crazy things on Facebook and online about, Hillary Clinton and Pizzagate or whatever, I would trust the news pages, the news report of the Wall Street Journal. The Wall Street Journal is owned by Rupert Murdoch. Its editorial page leans right. If there's a news organization and an owner that's going to, reveal a big scandal involving Democrats, it would be the Wall Street Journal. And the reason I'm sort of mentioning the Journal, and I'll talk about, newspapers in general and other news organizations, is that when I, edit or write a story for the New Yorker, it's reviewed by a lawyer. At all the kind of established newspapers and magazines and news organizations, we all face the threat of libel. if I write something that's just false, that defames someone, I can be sued. And that's a very good check on me as a journalist to make sure that I'm not exaggerating what I'm saying. And one of the strange developments as the internet was growing was that there was an exclusion written into the law. So currently, Google, Twitter, and Facebook have no responsibility to try to verify and face no consequences when completely false information goes up on their platforms. I think that's a huge problem. And I think that, you know, these big tech companies should have more responsibility. They say they're trying to vet their content. They don't want to get involved in censorship, but it's astounding that we have these enormously accessible platforms, but there's absolutely no penalty or no system for vetting information or putting up false information. And if, you know, you lean left, you could, you know, read the Washington Post and the New York Times. I know that there's big numbers of people who don't trust any of those news organizations, particularly conservatives, but I would go back to my Wall Street Journal analogy. I have friends who work there. It's a tremendous organization. If it's not being reported in the Wall Street Journal as some explosive allegation involving the Biden family, again, it's probably not true. Journalists are ambitious and like to break big stories, and that's what I think. But again, I'm biased.
Okay, this questioner asks you to please discuss the recent Senate report on Russia and Trump. If they say it should be a big story, though Trump, Barr, etc., will ignore it or denounce it as fake.
I can talk about Bill Barr, who has, you know, as I said, it seemed to be an example of Republicans, you know, putting the facts that were produced, the intelligence finding, and that Russia did intervene ahead of their party. And I think when either party does that, that's a positive thing. You know, Bill Barr is convinced that there was something improper in the launching of the Trump-Russia investigation. I mentioned that one of the characters in the book is Jim Baker, the former. He went on after 9/11 and, you know, protesting the spooky stuff, the surveillance. He works as the general counsel of the FBI through the summer of 2016. He insists that they had to open the investigation, that they had, you know, the emails had been stolen from Democrats. President Trump had stood up at a press conference and called for Russia to find Hillary Clinton's email. You know, without the dossier, they had the report of George Papadopoulos telling the foreign diplomat that the Russians had dirt on Hillary Clinton they wanted to solve. And Michael Horowitz, the Inspector General, independent Inspector General, you know, said it was properly predicated, i.e. there was enough evidence to launch an investigation. Barr says that's not true. He says there, you know, wasn't nearly enough evidence and that this was a travesty, one of the greatest travesties he's seen. One of the problems is that after 9/11, the amount of evidence that you needed to open a criminal investigation was very, very small. And that was lowered and both parties accepted it. So it was a very small amount of evidence that allowed this full investigation by the FBI to be launched. But it was legal. So I'm interested to see, you know, what comes out of the Barr investigation, if he finds anything, you know, but we'll see. One proposal Barr has made is that there be a higher standard of evidence before the FISA court or the FBI can surveil anyone involved in a political campaign. I think that's a great new standard. I think that should be enacted. But again, under the standards that existed in 2016, you know, it was proper to open the investigation. And again, as you said, the Senate committee affirmed the basic finding of these intelligence analysts that Russia intervened.
This questioner would like to know, how can the Fisa court regain its credibility? I know that various agencies requested controls to be relaxed, but it's time to reverse those back to its original intent.
I think there should be more transparency. It's a one-sided process. You know, you have Justice Department lawyers like Jim Baker, who in the past did it for years, who are presenting these cases. It's not an adversarial system. I don't know how you'd get a defense attorney in there. could there be some sort of public defender who somehow, participates in these proceedings and questions some of the evidence that the FBI is producing? In the most recent report that Michael Horowitz, the Inspector General of the Justice Department, produced, he looked at other FISA warrants that had nothing to do with the Trump-Russia investigation, and there was massive problems in those investigations as well. Again, one of the most glaring problems was Carter Page and this FBI lawyer who changed the meaning of an email that said Page was cooperating and telling the CIA about his meetings with Russian officials, and that email was changed. The meaning was reversed to say that he wasn't cooperating with the CIA. That's egregious. Horowitz found that two of the first two applications to surveil Carter Page were lawful. The final two were not. Carter Page, never should have been surveilled for that long. His civil liberties were violated. That's wrong. So I think opening up the process, more transparency, more press access, and getting these judges to act as a adversarial separate branch of government, is what we need. I think you need oversight of the FBI and CIA by all three branches of the government and by the press as well. The more oversight, the better. The more concentration of power and the less and the more secrecy, from what I saw, tends to lead to abuses. We've seen that over and over in this country.
Okay, this question asks, what do you think is the impact of concerns of a deep state's existence in terms of America's engagement with foreign countries, particularly Latin American countries after the Cold War and the covert operations in countries America is trying to export democracy to?
I think, the U.S. has a giant credibility problem because of what it's done in the past. President Trump has pointed out how we've meddled in elections in the past. We have, in terms of coups, we are theoretically out of that business. That again, many people don't believe this happened, but part of the reforms in the 70s were that the presidents would have control of all the covert actions. They would have to approve everything. They would have sort of political accountability for these programs. I do think we lack. We have how does a democracy have an intelligence service that goes out and steals secrets? Every Western democracy sort of struggles with this, and how should it go about stealing the secrets that intelligence officials, say are important to protecting the country? So we have a bad problem from our past actions, and many people doubt that we've stopped it. Tremendous problems with the use of torture and rendition after 9/11. A tremendous sense that the FBI, profiled Muslims, and that's continued. And those are all areas we need to improve on. The only thing I would say is that post 9/11, the use of torture and rendition was approved by the president. It was approved by the George W. Bush Justice Department. This wasn't a rogue CIA operation. The eavesdropping, again, by the NSA after 9/11 was approved by the president. Drone strikes is another thing that I think hurts our credibility around the world. But again, the president who used the most drone strikes was Barack Obama. He set up a system of more transparency and oversight, but there was an astounding, one drone strike killed an American citizen, Anwar al-Awlaki. He had inspired attacks inside the United States, but that was an extraordinary moment. It was the American government killing an American citizen without any of the evidence against al-Awlaki being made public. So I think the country not living up to its ideals, its talk about democracy, its talk about a fair judicial process, undermines our credibility around the world. And as you said, in Latin America, where we had a long history of intervening.
This viewer wants to know if you have any thoughts on Facebook and Cambridge Analytica.
I think, again, I want to give the trite answer. I tend to push back on conspiracy theories. And again, I'm a mainstream journalist and might be biased and have been around too many government officials, but I again would say that Cambridge Analytica is taking advantage of, and the Russians of our pre-existing biases and divisions, and that's something that we need to take responsibility for and face face up to. Sorry, we are totally ill-equipped for the digital age in terms of our data. What should be private and what isn't private. An NSA official recently wrote about this, that soon the most data that is collected on all of us, or even in the world, will actually be held by private tech companies. It will be Facebook and Google that will know more about what we do and where we go and how we spend our money than the government knows. Yet we have been unable since 9/11 to come up with any kind of political consensus about when should the government have the ability to hack into an Apple iPhone. We've been sort of deadlocked on this for now more than a decade. We're divided more than ever. And I think that I'm just riffing here a bit off of mentioning Cambridge Analytica, is that, there is some agreement on surveillance. There is this political alliance in the Senate right now between Senator Rand Paul, the Libertarian Republican of Kentucky, and Senator Ron Wyden, one of the most liberal members of the Senate from Oregon. And they, have battled and introduced measures over and over again to limit NSA surveillance. Wyden says that there's too much secret law. Again, a little anecdote about Obama. When the Wyden, I'm sorry, I apologize with all the names. When the Snowden revelations came out, what was interesting was that every one of those surveillance programs, again, had been approved by the Fisa court, and they were lawful. And the Obama administration officials said, but we did all the right things. We followed the procedures from way back in the 70s. We had a judge approve all this, but the extent of the surveillance really shocked the American public. So I think that's a way to move forward, if we could ever agree, is that the big tech companies have too much information about us. The government has lots of information about us. Our lives are more, the details of our lives are now recorded in every keystroke. And, there's a way to move forward that, that conservatives and liberals both want to protect our privacy, and to not have situations where Cambridge Analytica can manipulate us using our data.
So we have a question from Randy. He asks, how do quiet agencies like the DIA and the NSA, which reportedly dwarf the CIA, factor into the deep state?
They're the most critical players. Again, I would argue in the digital age. It's way back when I was working on a story about the CIA under Brennan and how he was trying to deal with the changes that have come about in the digital age. One of the challenges that sort of covert operatives face was that all of us now have a digital trail. We are going through a toll booth and our Easy Pass gets, checked. We go to, Chipotle and buy lunch and we put it on our ATM card. We post pictures of our families on Facebook. So when the CIA would try to, insert a covert operative with a false identity in a foreign country, they had to create a whole digital trail that listed an entire lifetime for these people. And it's actually, the ability of technology, the ability of the NSA and the DIA to collect information about people, to verify who they are and who they're not, has just been, increasing, doubling and tripling over the years. There's these vast now facilities that the NSA has built to hold data, and Amazon and the big tech companies are doing the same thing. So how do we govern the use of that information? How do our elected officials have the power to know what these agencies are doing? When is it in the public good? If you have coronavirus, this is the big issue with South Korea. They have a very extensive tracking program where they use cell phone data to track where people who've tested positive are going. Americans would resist that. But is that a positive use of data to help public health? And again, we have just no agreement on how to control these agencies and how to control who gets access to this data.
Okay. This next question, should whistleblowers get better protection from the government? What are the incentives they have to leak information about the deep state?
So one of the anecdote that starts the book is actually Trump had just been sworn in as president of the United States, and I knew a person, a government official, who said they wanted to meet with me, and the official said that he had heard about President Trump's first call with Vladimir Putin from the Oval Office, and it didn't go well, according to the source. Trump, in the middle of the conversation, Putin, mentioned the main nuclear arms agreement between the U.S. and Russia, and Trump didn't kind of recognize the name of it and just sort of seemed confused, and he asked his aide a question. And then the rest of the call, Trump, bragged about the size of the crowd at his inauguration. That was leaked to me. That was the president's phone call. That's secret information. And the Washington Post had, a leak, and I wrote a piece about that for Reuters, about that first phone call with a colleague of mine there. And another call with the Prime Minister of Australia leaked, and them fighting Trump and the Prime Minister of Australia. Another call leaked about Trump and the President of Mexico. And the reaction of the new Trump administration officials was sort of fury, and they were going to launch criminal investigations. And this is where the whole thing, starts, in this sense of a Trump White House that's under siege, and they think that these career government officials are leaking things to kind of sabotage them. My source was very afraid that they would go to jail, that there would be this sort of hunt for who leaked these phone calls. We kind of broke off contact. I'm biased. I'm a journalist. I probably welcome leaks. I wrote that story because I didn't think it, if it's a leak that's not endangering national security, that's not endangering service members or American citizens, I think, and it's a leak that's basically embarrassing to a president, and that's what I felt the Putin call was. I think it's fine to report that information to the public. There's an interest, the public and the voters should hear about how the new president's conducting himself on these phone calls. And as long as the details, again, aren't endangering anyone, I don't think that that's a terrible criminal act that's endangering the country. I know others disagree. And the sense I had from my source was just a sense of alarm about how this new administration was functioning. And I would just emphasize that sort of telling me about that phone call is not the equivalent of like actively plotting a coup, to remove the president from power. And I should say that there wasn't sort of a denial of what Trump said in these phone calls. He conducted himself that way in these phone calls. So anyway, I would just say the responsibility in terms of leaking about the deep state, it's any abuse of power. So if the NSA is collecting information it shouldn't be collecting, they should, whistleblowers should leak to journalists about that. If the president's doing something improper, Republican, Democrats, I'm biased, but I believe in transparency and airing things. So I would want whistleblowers to blow the whistle on anybody, not just blow the whistle for someone based on kind of political goal that they're trying to achieve.
This next question is, you mentioned Horowitz. He was recently released from his IG position. Do you think this was justified, or do you think it was some sort of retaliation?
I do fear, and this is sort of one of the more controversial findings I have in the book. I talk about Trump is sort of gathering. He's very suspicious of inspectors general. He's very suspicious of Mueller, the special prosecutor. I would praise Mueller from Trump's behalf. I mean, basically Mueller came to the conclusion that there was not clear evidence of collusion by Trump and his campaign, and he did a full investigation, and he did not find collusion, and that's the way it should have gone. That was a good thing for Trump. That was a fair outcome. Many argue there shouldn't have been an investigation, but I applaud Mueller, and I think people should accept Mueller's report in terms of that. But there's a deep suspicion, and what worries me is that that the president, is sort of tweeting out policies because he doesn't trust the people around him. I was told by one former White House official to implement them, to carry them out, that he'll say he wants to pull U.S. troops out of Syria, and aides will, try to talk him out of it or not do it. So he'll just tweet out the policy. And what I fear is that the president has this smaller and smaller circle of kind of informal advisors that he trusts, and that the policies being made through Rudy Giuliani, who was sort of carrying out, a private foreign policy on behalf of the president in Ukraine. And I kind of say in the book that there's a danger that, Trump is sort of says he's battling the deep state. And I define the deep state as like a group of people who are secretly carrying out policy in private. And there's no public processes about what they're doing. And so if you look at what Trump is doing, where he's barring officials from testifying before Congress, he's stonewalling all subpoenas before Congress, and there's less and less transparency about what he's doing, and that he's creating sort of this parallel private government with private people like Rudy Giuliani. Ironically, Trump is sort of creating a deep state of his own, where we don't know what's going on in the White House, who the visitors are, who the donors are, what is Rudy Giuliani doing, and you have a lot more transparency when that's being carried out by the Secretary of State. And the president could be doing this out of fear, that he fears he can't trust any of these government officials. He could be doing it out of calculation, but that dynamic of a sort of private officials and no transparency, again, I think is a dangerous one.
We have time for one last question, and this one is, do you have any advice on diffusing the term deep state as a weapon when chatting with conspiracy-minded family members?
I have family members that, love the president. I have family members who hate the president. I don't like the term deep state. I think it's charged. I think, people mock President Trump and question his, sanity at times. He's an extremely effective communicator and a messenger. And what he's done is kind of use this deep state term to discredit he uses it to discredit rival sources of information, fake news, as a way to kind of discredit the news media. And he's done that effectively. And so, there's a little chart in the book that says, again, as I said earlier, if you don't like government, you call it the swamp. If you don't like Washington, you call it the swamp. But if you do, you call them, politicians, there's, statesmen and stateswomen. So I would try to use more neutral terms, that aren't so charged. There is going to be, I call it an institutional government, a permanent government. We do need a small government. We don't need a big one, but we need one that's effective. And there's going to be people, running national parks. There's going to be in our towns, police officers and school teachers. There's got to be medical experts that help us with public health, as we've seen now in the coronavirus. And I would sort of urge, in your own outlook and talking to relatives, to say, be skeptical of government officials, be skeptical of journalists on the left or the right, but try not to be cynical. I think, Anthony Fauci is sort of trying to do his level best. I think most government officials are trying to do their jobs as best they can. I think most journalists who are reporters are trying to get the rough truth out. I know that vast numbers of people disagree with me, but avoiding all this charged language, accusing each side of destroying democracy, accusing each side of having the worst motives, could help. At least you'll be turning down the volume, because I just do worry about, as we go into this very heated election, again, about this cycle of distrust and division and conspiracy theory. We need to tone it down, not win at all costs. You don't have to win every argument at the table. And we have to agree on some basic facts, or as coronavirus shows, we're not going to be able to save each other's lives in situations like this.
Well, thank you so much, David. This was a really, really amazing talk. Very insightful. Everyone, if you want to purchase David's book, which I highly recommend, it's called In Deep, and you can click the green button below the screen. That will take you to Politics and Prose's website. And yeah, David, you have any final words?
Just thank you all for coming. And stay safe and stay safe, and don't be cynical about the motives of others on the other side of the political spectrum, and read widely, and and vote. Vote for whoever you want. And just thank you again for listening to me tonight.
Thank you so much, everyone. Take care.